Tongue River Cave Incident. On June 2, 2004, 5 teenagers gathered at Tongue River Cave in Wyoming. Barry Blaha and Dana Herbert, both 16, convinced their friends to explore the cave. None of them had any real caving experience. They brought cheap flashlights, batteries. They had no helmets or proper caving equipment. The group entered the cave and made their way deeper into the cave. The main passage was spacious at first. They could walk upright and move around easily. As they went deeper, they discovered multiple side passages. Some passages led to dead ends. Barry noticed a narrow crack in the wall that seemed to lead further into the cave. This wasn't on any map. The group crowded into the opening and shined their lights into the passage. The walls looked fractured and unstable. Small stones scattered when touched. Barry and Dana decided to push further into this narrowing passage. While their friends explored other areas, they squeezed through sections. Barry reached a point where the passage became impossibly tight. The walls closed in so much that he couldn't squeeze through. Barry decided to try clearing the obstruction by moving rocks. He managed to work one arm free and grabbed a rock about the size of a softball. Barry began using this rock as a hammer. He struck the larger stones ahead of him to break them apart. Dust began raining down from the ceiling. Suddenly, a massive boulder over 300 pounds broke free from the ceiling. It crashed down directly behind Dana. The fallen boulder had completely sealed the passage. Barry and Dana were trapped in a space barely larger than a coffin. Their friends immediately tried to move the boulder but couldn't. The air in their tiny prison grew stale and warm. Each breath felt insufficient. Muscle cramps set in from being unable to move. Their friends raced back through the cave to get help. They ran to the surface and called emergency services. Professional rescuers arrived with specialized tools. Moving a 300-pound boulder in a narrow cave passage was very challenging. Rescuers had to work in shifts. Only 1 or 2 people could access the work area at a time. Every tool had to be carried through the cave system by hand. Hours passed as the rescue became a race against time. Finally, the rescuers positioned their pulley system to move the boulder. Slowly, inch by inch, the 300-pound stone was pulled away. Barry and Dana could finally move again. They emerged from Tongue River Cave at approximately 10:30 p.m. They had been trapped for nearly 8 hours. Sloan Valley Cave Incident. On May 27, 2008, Steve Gladio led 4 novice cavers into the Sloan Valley Cave system. They planned to go from the post office entrance to the garbage pit entrance. At 11 a.m., the group entered the cave. They expected to emerge at 6 p.m. They encountered thigh-deep water in the big room. The bypass at Echo Junction was completely underwater. Darren, one of the novices, volunteered to swim the 175-foot passage. Darren began swimming. As Darren neared the end of the swim, fatigue overtook him. His arms felt heavy and each breath became desperate. Suddenly he cried out, "Help!" and disappeared beneath the water. Steve was a trained lifeguard and jumped into the water immediately. Steve swam towards Darren in the cold and darkness. When he reached Darren, he was barely conscious. Panic had set in, and Darren grabbed onto Steve. This dragged them both underwater. Steve managed to push Darren towards a steep, muddy bank. Darren was too weak to stand and could barely speak. His body was shutting down from hypothermia. Steve knew time was running out. Steve called out to the others to keep Darren awake. Then Steve swam into the other side. Steve reached the surface and called rescuers. Rescuer arrived within 10 minutes. Steve wanted to go back into the cave to help Darren. There was an argument with the rescuers. Steve grabbed 200 feet of rope, food, water, and a blanket. He stuffed everything into trash bags and headed back into the cave. 40 minutes later, Steve was back at Darren's side. Steve had Darren take off his wet clothes and dried him off. He gave Darren food and water. Slowly, Darren began to improve. The warmth and food helped revive him. It took the rescue squad 5 hours to get Darren across the lake. They carefully moved through the dark, dangerous waters. The entire rescue operation lasted 11 hours. Darren was saved from the brink of death. Thunder Canyon Cave Incident. Brent Coven was a 39-year-old software engineer. He and 6 other cavers were led by a guide named Luca Carabini. They wanted to explore Thunder Canyon Cave in eastern San Diego County. They had to drive a long way down a dirt road. Then they had to hike 2 miles through the wilderness. Recent rains had made the cave waters very dangerous. The calm cave waters had turned into a raging flood. This promised a thrilling but risky experience for the explorers. On Sunday, May 3, 2010, the group arrived at the cave at 11 a.m. They put on wetsuits and prepared their gear. The first challenge was a 45-foot rappel through a thundering waterfall. This would drop them into a chilly pool. Brent felt excited about this thrilling descent. Luca offered the group a chance to turn back, but their determination and thirst for adventure made them continue. Next, the group set up an 80-foot rappel. They continued through the cave, crawling, climbing, and walking through icy water. By 3 p.m., they reached the Terrible Traverse. This was a crack that is only 9 inches wide. People had to move sideways to get through it. A wooden board had been placed across the gap. This was to prevent people from sliding down and getting stuck. The crack goes down vertically for 200 feet. Luca led the way through the crack. He positioned himself to help from the other side. Steve followed, but his tiredness and fear got the better of him. Steve became stuck in the crack. Panic set in as Steve realized his worst nightmare was happening. The group worked together, pulling and pushing for 10 painful minutes. Finally, Steve was freed. Steve was shaken and traumatized. His priority now was to escape the cave as quickly as possible. As Steve's panic calmed down, one more caver went through the crack without problems. Luca then guided them to the exit. He was confident that Brent and Jim could handle the challenging passage. Brent felt his heart race as he approached the same opening that had trapped Steve. He prepared himself for the difficult move. Brent carefully moved his feet down the crack. Brent hesitated on his first attempt. He doubted his ability to squeeze through, but Jim's encouragement made him try again. Brent tried the passage again. However, Brent's hips wedged tightly in the crack. He was stuck and helpless with his face pressed against the rock wall. Luca rushed back to the scene. He and Jim started a desperate rescue effort. But despite their best efforts, Brent remained stuck. As 2 hours passed, Brent's arms went numb. He slid further into the crack. They realized the seriousness of their situation. Luca finally reached the exit and called for help. 4 experienced rescuers entered the cave. They assessed the situation and were shocked. Brent had been trapped for nearly 6 hours. His body was suffering from severe hypothermia. They slowly broke up the rocks that were pinning Brent in place. At 6 a.m., after a difficult 9 hours, Brent was finally freed from the crack. The group pulled him out and made sure he was conscious. They dragged him to the cave exit. Brent was rushed to the hospital for treatment. He had severe hypothermia and dehydration. Doctors reported that Brent was stable and expected to make a full recovery. Weatherly Well Cave Incident. On February 11, 1998, 4 friends named James Lewis, Alan England, Darl Moore, and Jerry Olson went to explore a cave. The cave was called Weatherly Well, and Jerry had just found it during a recent walk. The cave had a very small entrance. It was only 9 inches wide, about as wide as a dinner plate. This tiny gap led down 4 feet before opening to an 11-foot drop, followed by another 10-foot drop. The 4 friends looked at the narrow entrance. It was wet and very tight. From above, they could see the first drop going down into darkness. The passage beyond twisted like a corkscrew with very little room. The friends checked all their gear carefully. They knew only one person could enter at a time. Alan England, who was 63 years old but still very fit, was the smallest in the group. He volunteered to go first. The team secured a rope above ground to help Alan climb back up later. Then Alan began to squeeze into the tiny entrance. He had to twist his body to fit through the narrow space. His clothes got wet from the damp walls as he struggled through. After pushing through the tight entrance, Alan dropped down into a slightly larger space. The rope helped him lower himself safely. He was now 7 feet below the surface. He could finally stretch a little after the tight squeeze. Alan saw another 10-foot drop below him. His headlamp showed more twisting passages going deeper into the cave, but Alan knew it would be too dangerous to go further alone. He decided to turn back. Climbing back up the first part was easy, but when Alan reached the narrow entrance slot, he ran into big trouble. What had been easy to slide down was now almost impossible to climb up. Alan looked up at the tight slot above him. He started to climb, using the rope for help, but when he reached the narrow part, he couldn't move any further. The tight space pressed against his body, and he couldn't squeeze through. He twisted and pulled, trying to force his body back through the opening. But the slot seemed even tighter than before. His wet clothes stuck to his skin, making it harder to move. James and Darl noticed Alan was struggling. They tried pulling on the rope to help him, but the space was too tight. Each pull seemed to wedge Alan further into the rock. Alan was getting tired, and his hands were shaking from cold and effort. The cave was very cold, and it was winter outside too. Alan's wet clothes made him even colder. He started shivering badly. The tight space was so narrow he could barely even take a deep breath. James and Jerry tried to help by lowering extra clothes and warm drinks to Alan. Alan drank the warm liquid, but he was still very cold and stuck. Finally, Alan called out that he couldn't do this anymore. They needed to get help right away. James and Jerry quickly hiked back to Jerry's house and called the East Tennessee Cave Rescue Team. Within 2 hours, the rescue team arrived. By then, Alan had been trapped for nearly 5 hours. He was pale and shaking from the cold. He kept thinking about how easily he had slipped down through the slot, but now he couldn't get back up. The rescuers were skilled cave explorers with special tools. They gave Alan more clothes and food to fight against the cold. Then they set up a special system of ropes and pulleys to try to get him out. The rescue was very slow and painful. Alan could feel the cold rock scraping against his chest and shoulders as they pulled. The rescuers worked very carefully to avoid hurting him. After an hour of hard work, Alan finally came out of the tight slot. He was bruised but alive. The cold air outside felt good compared to the cave. Even though he was exhausted and cold, Alan wanted to walk back to the car by himself. Boy Scout Cave Incident. On December 27, 2003, 8 boys from the San Antonio Boy Village went to explore Boy Scout Cave in Florida. 2 counselors went with them but stayed outside the cave. Two of the boys were Michael Shiro, 15, and Javek Henderson, 16. They were excited to explore the deep, twisting cave. The counselors didn't go inside because they thought they were too big for the narrow spaces. Boy Scout Cave had many narrow tunnels and sharp turns. Most people thought it was safe because it wasn't wet and the walls didn't fall down. The temperature inside was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cooler than outside but not freezing. One of the counselors made a campfire near the cave entrance to stay warm. This would cause problems later. Michael and Henderson led the group into the cave. As they went deeper, it got very dark and quiet. The boys had to crawl and twist through tight passages. After about an hour, they came to a very hard part of the cave called the hairpin curve. This was a very narrow tunnel that made a sharp turn like a hairpin. The boys couldn't see what was around the corner. Michael went through first and Henderson followed, close behind. Suddenly, Henderson got stuck. He couldn't move forward or backward. His body was twisted in the tight space. Michael tried to help free his friend. The rest of the boys waited nervously in a wider part of the tunnel. Michael pushed and pulled, trying to get Henderson out. After trying for an hour to free Henderson, Michael got very tired. Even though the cave wasn't very cold, lying against the cool rock for so long made both boys lose body heat. Henderson was still stuck and he could only shout for help. The other boys started to panic. Some thought the campfire outside was using up all the oxygen in the cave, though this wasn't really happening. They were all scared. The boys had to make a hard choice. They couldn't free Michael and Henderson by themselves. They decided to leave their friends behind and go get help. When they reached the entrance, they told the counselors what happened. The counselors quickly put out the fire and called 911. Rescue teams arrived within an hour. They were experienced cave explorers who knew what to do. They brought special tools, including harnesses and chisels. When the rescuers reached the hairpin curve, they found a scary scene. Henderson was still awake but shaking and cold. Michael was unconscious. Both boys were showing signs of hypothermia, when your body gets too cold. The rescuers used chisels to make the narrow passage wider. It took over an hour to free Henderson. They wrapped him in a warm blanket and started moving him toward the entrance. Then they worked on freeing Michael. This was even harder because he couldn't help. After nearly 2 hours of chiseling, they finally got him out. His body was cold, and his pulse was weak, but he was alive. The rescue team carefully carried both boys out of the cave. Ambulances were waiting to take them to the hospital. Both boys had hypothermia but survived. Michael took a whole day to wake up. Real well cave incident. In March 1997, two friends named Andrew and Attila planned a cave adventure. They were excited to explore Real Well, a deep cave in Tennessee. The cave had a big 160-foot pit at its entrance. Andrew was 32 years old and had been in many caves before. Attila was 26 and had only visited 5 caves. They thought they were ready for this challenge. On March 18th, they arrived at the cave. It was a rainy day. They could hear water rushing into the cave entrance. They had wetsuits in their car, special clothes to keep warm in water, but they decided not to wear them. This was their first big mistake. Attila also forgot to bring a helmet. This was another mistake, but they were so excited that they didn't think about safety enough. Andrew went down the rope first. He felt cold water hitting his back as he slid down into the pit. By the time he reached the bottom, he was very cold and wet. Attila followed, and the water hit him even harder. Their headlamps showed beautiful cave walls, but the cold was already hurting them. After only 30 minutes of exploring, Attila started shaking from the cold. "Andrew, I can't stay down here," Attila said. "I think I need to get out." Andrew agreed. "All right, I'll get the ropes ready," he said. The waterfall was loud. Attila set up his climbing gear too quickly. He used the wrong kind of clips. Andrew noticed something was wrong with Attila's setup, but before he could say anything, Attila had already started climbing. Each move was hard because of the freezing water pouring over him. His gear was slippery and not working right. Halfway up, Attila stopped climbing. His muscles hurt, and he was very cold. Part of his gear had come loose, and he couldn't reach it to fix it. He tried to tell Andrew what was happening, but the waterfall was too loud. "Attila, come back down if you need to," Andrew shouted from below. Attila tried to answer, but Andrew could barely hear him. Finally, Andrew heard him call out, "I can't!" Andrew knew he had to help his friend. He started climbing up the rope toward Attila. It was very hard. The water was freezing, and his hands went numb. When Andrew reached Attila, things looked bad. Attila was hanging in his harness, awake but unable to move. His body was getting too cold. This is called hypothermia. He was shaking, his skin was pale, and he seemed very tired. Andrew tried to attach Attila to his own harness so they could go down together. But with the water pouring down and both of them so cold, it was too difficult. Then Andrew tried to climb out while pulling Attila with him. But after going up only 15 feet, Andrew was too tired to continue. Now both friends were stuck in the freezing waterfall. Andrew knew they were in serious trouble. Attila was getting worse, and Andrew was also very cold. In one last effort, Andrew swung over to a small ledge on the cave wall. He managed to pull himself onto it and unhook from the rope. He was so cold and tired that he passed out. When Andrew woke up hours later, he saw that Attila was still hanging in the waterfall but wasn't moving. With great sadness, Andrew realized his friend had died. With shaking hands, Andrew set up his gear again. He had to cut the rope connecting him to Attila. Then, he made the difficult climb out of the cave alone. When he reached the surface, he collapsed and called for help. Rescue teams came hours later and found Attila. The doctor said he had died from hypothermia. His body got too cold.